This is a TalkStation original podcast.
This is Christine Brin, and on this week's episode of Salty History, we will be talking with David Bennett from the North Carolina Maritime Museums about the history of tourism in coastal North Carolina, starting as early as the 1700s. Today we'll be touching on topics such as why the tourists are coming to the area and what they're doing while they're here. It all starts now on Salty History. Hello, my name is Christine Brin, and I am the Associate Curator of Education at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. And today I have with me David Bennett.
Hello, my name is David Bennett. I am the Curator of Maritime History for the North Carolina Maritime Museum System.
So I've been with the Maritime Museum for about, I want to say 14 years now. And since graduating from college in 2007, I've been with a variety of different sites that catered to tourism, including Plymouth Plantation up in Massachusetts and down here at the museum, which definitely caters to a lot of tourists. And I've got to admit that I've spent most of my life also occasionally being a tourist as well, which I think gives me a lot of vested interest in the history of tourism. You have a lot of experience working at sites that cater to tourists too.
Yep, spent my whole career in museums so far.
Yes, I would say you were in Virginia at the, I can't remember the name of the site that you're at in Virginia.
The Virginia War Museum.
The Virginia War Museum. You've been with us for quite a while.
Yep.
On a couple of different hats.
Third time
yes.
working for the Maritime Museum.
And then you've been a tourist on occasion too.
Yep.
We both have a lot of experience and interest in the tourism industry. And you do a great presentation, have done a lot of research into specifically North Carolina tourism and the history.
North Carolina coastal tourism, mostly in the 19th century and right around sort of the turn of the century.
One of the things that I found intriguing in your research was the discussions on why people have been coming to the coast and what they were doing when they were visiting. It's interesting the parallels between this early tourism and today's tourism.
Yeah, the things that people do today and the things that people did in the 19th century are really similar. They're just sort of did things in different ways. But the why is probably the biggest difference.
A lot of difference, but a lot of similarity. Because I think when you and I were talking previously, we were saying coming to the coast can be good for your health, a real come for our health. Mm-hmm. Today, we're coming more as a mental health situation where it's a calming scenario.
Yeah, you're trying to get away from work, you're trying to get away from the city.
Mm-hmm, take a break.
Yep.
I would say I live at the beach, and I still use the beach as my mental health break. But in the 19th century, early 20th century, we see them coming for different health-related reasons.
Yeah, because malaria was a huge problem in North Carolina.
Which I joke that, because obviously we don't have mosquitoes here at the coast, so we wouldn't have had a malaria problem, but
yeah, well,
we know today.
There's plenty of mosquitoes and all sorts of bugs here on the coast, but people thought in the 19th century, they didn't realize that mosquitoes were necessarily the vector. Mm-hmm. For malaria, they thought it was bad air. So just sort of like swamp gas.
You said malaria literally means bad air, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so people thought things like swamp gas was making them sick. They thought that sort of any sort of bad smell was a signal of something that wasn't good for you and that was potentially making you sick. A lot of that was really prevalent during the summer, and people were getting really sick during the summer, so they thought that they could escape to the beach to avoid the sickness because, you have this nice sea breeze, there's lots of fresh air, mm-hmm. and then salt water is good for healing.
And honestly, if you've got to be sick, you'd rather be sick at the beach.
Yeah.
Nicer place. And like you said, they didn't know the mosquitoes were the vector.
Yeah.
So they did genuinely think they were escaping that.
Yeah, they thought they were escaping the bad air.
Mm-hmm. Which they were to some extent. I mean, the air out here does feel fresher.
Yeah, but there's plenty of mosquitoes on like Ocracoke and, here.
And I believe there's studies that do show that salt water is good for the body. It's good for cleaning
it's good for,
out stuff. So in general, they would have felt a little bit of an improvement, especially to their mental health. And then you have this great quote that you feature in your presentation about coastal tourism, about a hotel in Ocracoke back in 1795 from Jonathan Price. He's promoting one of the hotels and coming to visit the area, saying this is a healthy spot. This healthy spot is in autumn, the resort of many of the inhabitants of Maine. One of its original proprietors, who has attained his 90th year, still resides on it and does not appear to feel any of the infirmities of age.
I don't think there's a hotel out on Ocracoke during the period, but people were probably renting houses.
Okay.
Like if you look at a lot of those sort of coastal communities like Beaufort during sort of the early periods, they're primarily renting out houses.
Okay,
until
so I
like
misspoke
later
on that one.
until like in the 19th century, you really start to see the rise of hotels and hotel resorts.
So this quote's more to do with promoting the area, not and coming to visit and saying like, look, it is a healthy place to come visit. Look at the locals. They're reaching their 90th year.
Yeah, it's mostly saying, this is a healthy spot on the coast.
Mm-hmm. So we got the why, includes health. Escaping malaria, though they weren't truly escaping it, which is not terribly different from what we're doing today for our health reasons. What other reasons were they coming to the coast?
The health is the big reason that people were coming out, but there's also a social and recreational aspect too, because you're not just going to leave home, move to the coast for the whole summer. It's not like they're coming out here for a weekend or a week. It was a whole summer that they would be here and, go back home in September. And so you got to find things to do to keep yourself occupied.
Was it a sign of status to be able to afford to come out for a full vacation?
By the time that hotel resorts were taken off, yeah.
Yeah, and it depends on where you stay, too. Some of the nicer hotels, if you stayed there, it was definitely a sign of status.
Right. Like in the late 19th century, you came to Morehead City, and you stayed at the Atlantic Hotel, which is sort of one of the best coastal resorts in eastern North Carolina. That was definitely a status symbol.
And then it was either going to be come to the coast, or you said go to the mountains.
Right.
I feel like the coast is definitely the better choice. It's my personal preference. Or there's the convenience factor too.
That certainly plays into it. I mean, it wasn't the easiest getting to the coast because you didn't have these coastal highways and you didn't have bridges going out to the Outer Banks, but you did have steamboat lines that ran regularly. You had schooners and sloops that ran regular routes to like Nag's Head and Ocracoke to ferry people from up on the Roanoke River, places like Hamilton, Williamston, Plymouth, or way up the sort of Chowan River. People were coming down and going all the way out.
And that
Nag's Head.
definitely influenced where people were going, was more of that, where these boats were taking them.
Right.
I forgot to mention, one of the more fashionable icons that came to visit coastal North Carolina was President Grover Cleveland back in December 1892. So we definitely see some almost celebrities visiting.
Early on. We definitely had some presidents in the late 19th century that came out here. Grover Cleveland, I think his Secretary of War also.
And that runs a parallel with modern tourism as well, because we see quite a few celebrities. I mean, every spring we hear about Michael Jordan coming to visit our area.
Yeah.
For
the Big Rock tournament.
So there's a couple parallels there. We're seeing a lot of those celebrities then and celebrities now, and that makes it even more of a status symbol to go to coastal North Carolina.
Yeah, and Morehead City also attracted a lot of North Carolina governors and a lot of politicians.
Now the question is, what were they doing? Like you said, they're not two different, very similar list what they were doing to what we are doing today. It's just how they were doing it.
Right.
And one of my favorite discussions is, so they were going to the beach. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you go to the coast, you're going to go out to the beach. Though I have to admit, I've met tourists that never make it past all the restaurants. And they maybe touch a toe to the beach. The primary reason for coming to the coast is to go to the beach. Mm-hmm. And the same was true for early tourism.
Yeah, people were spending a lot of time out on the beach. They're getting in the water. They're taking walks on the beach. They were riding horses and carriages, along the beach.
Yeah, and the discussion on riding, I mean, that is another similar thing to what we do today on the beach. It is not uncommon for some of our beaches to be open to people driving on the beaches, but they weren't driving horses today. They're driving four-wheelers and trucks on some of those beaches, as opposed to riding horses and buggies.
Yeah, a lot of these beach hotels had their own stables, and people could bring their horses to the beach. I know, like the Atlantic Hotel here in Morehead City, they had stables. People would put their horses on trains and bring them down. put them up in the stables, and then they'd ferry them across to Bogue Banks to go riding on the beach.
Literally bringing everything with them.
And that was also something that people did do.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So at the hotels, because they were going to stay there for months,
Yeah.
they would bring everything, including almost the kitchen sink.
Yeah, so people would, because they're there for several months, and not all of these hotels were thoroughly furnished, they would bring their beds sometimes, and they would bring their chairs, and they'd bring furniture with them, and they bring all kinds of household stuff they would fill up with into boats. And
Yeah.
then,
What I love is you have this great image of a wagon coming up from one of the boats that had been ferrying people over, not to the beaches, but to a hotel. And it is just loaded with furniture and looks quite overwhelmed.
yeah, in Nag's Head, they had a pier that was associated with the Nag's Head Hotel, and there's sort of this train track thing that ran to the end of the pier, and it had that wagon thing on it that was, pulled by a mule or horse, and people would just load up all their furniture in that wagon and have it pulled off to the hotel, and they would move in for the summer, or they would move into a house. There's all these beach houses.
Now, something so we were going back to the whole swimming and visiting the beach. So when we talk about them going and visiting the beach, and they have this infrastructure in place to get the furniture from the ships to the hotels, but infrastructure on the islands and on the beaches looked very different back in early tourism than it did today, obviously. So when they would go to visit a beach like, would it be Nag's Head, it would look very different than what you're visiting today, in that it was just, what would you refer to it, kind of like, not a wasteland, I don't want to call any...
Giant sand hills everywhere.
Sand hills.
Kind of like Jockey's Ridge, but everywhere. Maritime forests, and just very sparse out there. You didn't have any sort of tourist development out there till like the 1830s.
So we're not seeing any bathrooms. We're not seeing any stores out there.
We're not even seeing really any beach houses to speak of.
Well, you mentioned one of the things that was going on was the big sand hills. They were significantly larger then than they are today. They were still moving. They were still very active. They didn't have the beach grass in them like we have today.
Yeah.
So you would have tourists that would build beach houses out there and come back the next season, and the hill will have just buried it in the meantime. With the sand hills that you refer to, some of them got so large they became very iconic, and the tourists would actually go visit them, specific ones. Another parallel to today's tourism, because we still go visit Jockey's Ridge, which is an exceptionally large one. But one that I wanted to mention is you talk about a sand hill called Engagement Hill.
Yeah, Engagement Hill was one of the large sand hills over by Nag's Head. You had young men and women who'd climb to the top of it, and the young guy would propose to the young woman, and sometimes she said yes, and sometimes she said no, but it was very public. Very
public. Well, I saw that it got its reputation for being the place to go get engaged because in 1857, interestingly, you would think that it got its reputation because there was a successful engagement at the top of the hill, but there was a disappointing proposal.
Oh, yeah. It generated lots of gossip because it's very public. Everyone's like when two young people start to climb the hill, like everyone's taking notice and they're watching and they start gossiping. Usually if it's a happy engagement, if it all works out, both the young guy and woman just come walking back down together, and they're all happy and excited. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes one of them is walking down by themselves.
And that's what happened in this 1857 proposal. The guy was very much rejected, and everybody witnessed his probably one of the worst days that he'd had.
Yeah, as a young man. And then there's lots of juicy gossip about that as well.
And that stemmed that reputation for this engagement hill, which I thought was interesting, that why would anybody want to try proposing where it has a reputation for this guy getting rejected? But
well, I mean, I think it was famous for being like just a popular spot.
And it became it definitely. And I loved, you had a very sappy quote that went with it, where there's a newspaper that wrote about it, and he very much lays it on, going, "Sacred to Cupid, oh, could those mute sands a tale unfold? What words they'll tell of love that breathes and thoughts that burn." Yeah, he really laid it on heavy on that one.
They tend to do that back then.
Mm-hmm. We've touched on what they were doing was swimming, riding, visiting different sand hills, but they were also sightseeing in that they were visiting actual sites. There were no museums like our museum at the time, but they were visiting places like life-saving stations, lighthouses, shipwrecks. But when you think about life-saving stations, which were buildings set up and manned for the express purpose of responding to ships that had wrecked off of the coast, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as a tourist destination, but they did prove to be them.
Well, there's just not a whole lot on the Outer Banks, and so people are trying to find things to do to fill their time. These life-saving stations had a lot of downtime as well. You know, ships that are constantly being wrecked all the time. And so they would take people out fishing and oystering and stuff like that. And
crews had to find a way to entertain themselves just as well. And the tourists were very entertaining, I imagine.
And so they just kind of entertained each other. And then also, you know, the life-saving stations are having to do drills, and they're constantly training with the surf boats and the breeches buoys and all this sort of equipment that would have been sort of novel for the tourists. And so they would have been able to watch that.
Today we still watch reenactment of drills at life-saving stations. So I could see where the appeal is, because we still have it. We're still interested today. You mentioned shipwrecks, so they would go visit shipwrecks.
Tourists still do that today on the Outer Banks and,
definitely.
you know, Core Banks. And they would find these wrecks, and then they would start breaking things off of them and
taking souvenirs.
pieces of these shipwrecks home as souvenirs. Unfortunately, tourists still do that today.
Yeah. I mean, you take a shell off the beach. Why wouldn't you take a piece of wood off of a shipwreck?
Well, because
we know better today.
Yes.
Well, I do not encourage anybody to take pieces of our shipwrecks.
It's federal property.
Yes.
So.
But there was one shipwreck that was very popular with visitors in the late 1800s, because there was a ship that wrecked off of the off the coast. It was, I want to say it right, the Huron.
The Huron.
Huron. In 1877, it wrecked, and it became a very popular spot for tourists to visit because it wasn't too far from the hotel at Nag's Head. So it was something that the tourists could easily access. But also, shortly after it wrecked, divers were actively salvaging parts of that wreck.
Right, yeah. So, and that was a submerged wreck. You know, a lot of the wrecks that we were talking about were ones that were beached. But yeah, this one was submerged. And with the salvage operations going on at the time, they were using explosives.
Dynamite, yes.
Yeah. You know, these plumes of water going up into the air. Yeah, it was all very dramatic, very exciting.
And it had to be kind of like with the life-saving service, where they were enjoying watching the drills and seeing all this equipment that they may not have normally been familiar with. Same with the divers and the salvagers. They're seeing a lot of equipment, because specifically what they were trying to salvage were cannons and machinery. So that would have been coming up on the beach as they were salvaging it, which is stuff that most of the tourists would not have been familiar with as well. Just like any modern wreck site, when we're recovering artifacts from those wreck sites on modern Greece, which is a wreck that was recovered down in the Wilmington area.
Yeah.
People are always taking an interest in those artifacts that have come up from there. So we see, well, I mean, we have 3 museums with artifacts from shipwrecks, so there's definitely a modern interest in that. So shipwrecks, they're visiting lighthouses too. Not so much Cape Hatteras, because there's not much development out there as far as tourism.
Yeah, that's too far south.
And maybe not Cape Lookout.
You did have Cape Lookout,
okay.
Yes. Cape Lookout was definitely a popular spot.
Now, were they climbing the lighthouses or just going and visiting them?
I know for Cape Lookout, they were climbing them for sure.
Okay, so they're going out to visit them, similar to what we're seeing modern tourism do as well. So another parallel right there. So they're swimming, they're riding, they're visiting different sites like lighthouses, they're exploring, they're getting engaged. And this touches on the socializing going on on the coast as well, where we're seeing as the hotels become more prominent. You said they started popping up along the coast in the late...
So like, you had the Nag's Head Hotel, which was the first sort of coastal resort, and I think that was late 1830s that one popped up.
And then the infamous, well, locally infamous Atlantic Hotel.
Well, you had the Atlantic Hotel in Beaufort, which was blown down in a hurricane in the late 1870s. And then you had the Atlantic Hotel that was built in Moorhead in the downtown area, which was huge and probably one of the nicest, largest coastal resorts in North Carolina. For its time, yeah.
Yeah. And that one, you see a lot of descriptions that involve like socializing in the way of parties and events going on.
Had one of the nicest ballrooms in North Carolina.
Yeah, you don't imagine people coming to the beach and putting on a ball gown, but they were doing it.
It was definitely the popular thing to do. It was also the popular, fashionable thing, status symbol thing to sponsor a ball.
Okay.
So,
at the beach.
Yeah, you would.
At the coast.
So like one of the things that people would do is you would have maybe a man who's trying to impress a woman would throw a ball in honor of that woman that he's trying to impress.
So the coast and romance. We talked about Engagement Hill. We're talking about sponsoring a ball. We see a lot of romance both in the way of getting engaged and also in the way of a little bit of, I think you called it heavy petting.
Oh, yeah.
Atlantic Hotel had a article that came out about them.
So you had the gossip columnist from the Raleigh, I think from maybe this might have been the News Observer, would hang out at the Atlantic Hotel during the summer and report on everything that was going on. There's these teenage boys and girls who at night would go sneak out of the dances and get into a boat, like a Sharpie that was tied up to the dock, and kind of have sort of parking kind of stuff going on.
I feel like local kids still get into parked boats or dock boats and take advantage of those private moments.
I'm sure. But yeah, there's that sort of thing was documented as going on in like the 1880s.
And then before we wrap up, I do want to discuss that there is one other tourist practice that they were doing back in the early tourism that is still parallel today. And I was surprised to hear this. There's ghost hunting. Yeah,
up in Nag's Head, Roanoke Island, people would go out at night because they would swear they would see this sort of glowing orb over Roanoke Sound. And they would always try to find it, and when they found it, they would try to catch up to it, but right before they could get close to it, it would just vanish. And so, yes, there's all these ghost stories. And
I mean, and we see that still today, ghost tours going on all over the place, and there's a lot of interest, especially as the fall season comes around and we get closer to the Halloween. But yeah, I was surprised to hear that this ghost hunting sounds kind of like snipe hunting. That's not specific to North Carolina, I know, but... For those that may not be familiar, there is a bird called a snipe, but when you talk about snipe hunting, it is definitely a trick that somebody is playing on you. You send a kid out with a bag to the beach and tell him to go catch a snipe, which is described as a squirrel-like bird. Does not exist for the record, so I don't want to break anybody's heart. If somebody's ever sent you snipe hunting, they're definitely just trying to keep you busy. But as a tip to a parent, if you're ever out on the beach and you want to keep your kid busy, give them a bag and tell them to go hunt some snipes. Actually, I found out that snipe hunting's been going on since the 1840s. They might have been doing that the same when they were first coming to the coast as well.
Maybe.
Yeah. So in review, we see a lot, like you said at the beginning, best quote I had the whole time was early tourism. We see them, it's not they were doing, what they were doing and why they were coming wasn't very different. It was just how they were doing it. They were coming for many of the same reasons, for health reasons, even though they were looking more to escape malaria and for physical health benefits, and we're looking more for those mental health benefits. They're coming down to socialize and to go to the beach and go swimming and such, same things as us, go riding on the beach. Interestingly, going ghost hunting, and we're doing the same thing today.
And hunting and fishing and boating.
Oh yeah, we didn't even touch on the hunting and the fishing and the boating.
Yeah, all the same stuff.
Yes, just looked a little different. I'm interested to hear what everybody that's been listening, what do you think makes coastal North Carolina such an attractive vacation destination? We touched on some of the things that have historically made it an attractive destination, but I'm interested to hear, is it the history? Is it the beaches? Is it the shopping? I want to know what brings you to the beach, what brings you to the coast, and why do you think it's so attractive to tourism and continues to be? Comment on this podcast or the museum's social media to let me know. Once again, we are here from the North Carolina Maritime Museum, and our website is ncmaritimemuseums.com. And until next time, we wish you fair winds and following sea.